This is MTG Burgeoning, and in this video we are going to showcase the quintessential cards needed to build the core of an Azorius commander deck with Hilda of the Icy Crown as the general. Hilda of the Icy Crown debuted in Wilds of Eldraine and is a 3/4 human warlock for 2 in Azorius colors. That's 1 white and 1 blue mana. Whenever we tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, we may pay 1 generic mana. If we do, then we choose one of the following 3 options. We create a 4/4 white and blue elemental creature token, we put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control, or we scry 2 and then draw a card. Hilda provides creature token production, a +1/+1 counter delivery system for our creatures, and card advantage. All we have to do is tap our opponent's untapped creatures and have mana available to pay the cost of our general's ability. With this in mind, we will inundate the core of this build with spells and abilities that tap our opponent's untapped creatures for the purposes of activating Hilda's ability as frequently as possible. Through this dynamic, we will strengthen and enhance our side of the battlefield and maintain a steady stream of card draw as we overwhelm and out-resource our opponents on the path to imminent victory. Let's begin crafting the core of this build with a smattering of cards that tap our opponent's untapped creatures. When Shirai of Numbing Depths enters the battlefield, we tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. If a permanent with a stun counter on it would become untapped, then we remove a stun counter from it instead. As an additional benefit to our tap our opponent's creatures theme, whenever we tap one or more untapped creatures our opponents control, we draw a card. Although this ability only triggers once each turn, we could easily trigger it multiple times during a round of turns. When Solitary Sanctuary enters the battlefield, we tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. As another thematic benefit, whenever we tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, we put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. This last ability, when paired with Hilda's +1/+1 counter ability, can make our creatures even more threatening. Pressure Point, Plunge into Winter, and Freeze in Place tap target creature. Pressure Point also draws us a card, while Plunge has us scry 1 before drawing a card, and Freeze in Place has us scry 2. You See a Guard Approach has us either tap target creature or give target creature we control hexproof until end of turn. Urza's Rebuff allows us to either counter target spell or tap up to 2 target creatures. Succumb to the Cold taps 1 or 2 target creatures an opponent controls. We put a stun counter on each of them. Repel the Darkness and Expose Evil tap up to 2 target creatures, and we respectively draw a card and investigate, which means that we create a Clue artifact token for which we can pay 2 generic mana and sacrifice to draw a card. Feeling of Dread also taps up to 2 target creatures, and it has flashback, which means that we may cast this card from our graveyard for its flashback cost of 1 and 1 blue mana, and then we exile it upon resolution. Stall for Time taps up to 2 target creatures and we draw a card. This instant also has a kicker cost of 1 and 1 blue mana, and if we pay this additional cost to cast the spell, then we put a stun counter on each of those creatures as well. Jeru's Renunciation taps up to 2 target creatures, or we can cycle this card away from our hand by paying 1 white mana and discarding it in order to draw a card instead. Send to Sleep does the same without the cycling option, but it also has the Spell Mastery mechanic, which means that if there are 2 or more instant and or sorcery cards in our graveyard, the tapped creatures do not untap during their controller's next untap steps. Frost Breath does the same without needing the Spell Mastery mechanic. Downpour and Choking Tethers respectively tap up to 3 and 4 target creatures. If we cycle Choking Tethers away from our hand for 1 and 1 blue mana, we may tap target creature in addition to drawing a card. For bigger tapping returns from our mana investments, Gigadrouse taps target permanent, and it has the Replicate mechanic, which means that when we cast the spell, we copy it for each time we paid its Replicate cost. We may choose new targets for the copy. Icy Blast and Glimpse the Sun God tap X target creatures, and through its ferocious mechanic, if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, then Icy Blast does not let those creatures untap during their controller's next untap steps. Glimpse the Sun God also lets us scry 1, while Gridlock taps X target non-land permanents. Instead of choosing which of our opponent's creatures to tap, let's just tap them all. Sleep taps all creatures target player controls, and those creatures do not untap during that player's next untap step. Cryptic Command has 4 modes from which to choose, and we may choose 2 of them. We counter target spell, we return target permanent to its owner's hand, we tap all creatures our opponents control, and/or we draw a card. The triple blue mana cost of this spell is not a constraint, since this is a 2-color build. Bluster Squall has us tap target creature we don't control, but if we pay its overload cost of 3 and 1 blue mana, then we tap each creature we don't control instead. Thought-Weft Gambit taps all creatures our opponents control and untaps all creatures we control. When Tempest Caller enters the battlefield, we tap all creatures target opponent controls. When Jitsarai Monk and Subjugator Angel come into play, we tap all creatures our opponents control. Bond of Discipline does the same, but also gives creatures we control lifelink until end of turn. Note that we can pay 1 generic mana for each one of our opponent's creatures that are tapped these ways in order to activate Hilda's ability. Cone of Cold taps all creatures our opponents control regardless of the result of our D20 roll. If, however, the result of our D20 roll is between 10 and 19, then those creatures do not untap during their controller's next untap steps. If, again, however, the result is 20, then not only do those creatures not untap during their controller's next untap steps, but until our next turn, creatures our opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. By rolling 20, it allows us to utilize our mana resources for paying Hilda's ability as, hopefully, our opponents decide to do their part and put some creatures onto their side of the battlefield. For repeatable tapping effects, we can tap Fate Stitcher in order to tap or untap another target permanent. This zombie wizard also has the Unearth mechanic, which means that we can pay a blue mana and return this card from our graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, and we exile it at the beginning of the next end step, or if it would leave the battlefield. We can only unearth as a sorcery, but because of the haste enablement here, we can tap it to tap one of our opponent's creatures before it is exiled. We also can tap Ballynock Trapper and Minister of Impediments to tap target creature. Note that whenever we cast a white spell, we may untap the Trapper. We should have little difficulty in activating the Trapper's ability multiple times during a turn or a round of turns. We can pay 1 generic mana and tap Icy Manipulator to tap target artifact, creature, or land. We can pay 1 generic mana and tap Hilda's Crown of Winter to tap target creature. However, if it is our turn, then this artifact's activation cost is reduced by 1 generic mana, meaning that we can simply tap it to tap target creature. We can also pay 3 generic mana and sacrifice Hilda's Crown of Winter to draw a card for each tapped creature our opponents control. Due to the theme of this build, Hilda's Crown of Winter could do a lot of work for us through its burst card draw potential and repeatable tap target creature ability. Speaking of tapping target creature, Gold Meadow Harrier, Gideon's Lawkeeper, Squall Drifter, and Blinding Mage follow suit by paying a white mana and tapping them. Scepter of Dominance has the same activation cost, but taps target permanent instead of tapping target creature. We can tap or untap target creature by paying 1 blue mana and tapping Niblis of the Breath. We can pay 1 and 1 white mana and tap Giant Killer to tap target creature. The adventure side of this card, Chop Down, has us destroy target creature with power 4 or greater at instant speed. We can pay 2 and a white mana to have Azorius Guildmage tap target creature, and we can pay 2 and a blue mana to have a counter target activated ability. Note that we do not have to tap the Guildmage for the purposes of activating its abilities, which means that we can activate them both during the same turn or multiple times during a turn or round of turns. We have other repeatable tapping effects as well. Mind Games taps target artifact, creature, or land, and through its buyback mechanic, we may pay an additional 2 and 1 blue mana as we cast the spell in order to return this card to our hand after it resolves. Since Mind Games is an instant with buyback, it can cause a lot of headaches for our opponents during the game. Hands of Binding taps target creature an opponent controls, and that creature does not untap during its controller's next untap step. This sorcery has the Cipher mechanic, which means that we may exile this card encoded on a creature we control. Whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player, its controller may cast a copy of the encoded card without paying its mana cost. Hidden Strings also has the Cipher mechanic, and we may tap or untap target permanent, and then we may tap or untap another target permanent as well. Since our predominant theme here is tapping our opponent's creatures, we should have little difficulty triggering the ciphered cards through blockerless combat, especially if we have opposition on our side of the battlefield. We can tap an untapped creature we control to tap target artifact, creature, or land. For more repeatable tapping options, we have Retreat to Coral Helm. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we choose one of the following two options. Through this enchantment's landfall ability, either we may tap or untap target creature, or we scry one. Guardian of Tazim also has landfall. We tap target creature an opponent controls, and if the land that comes into play is an island, then that creature does not untap during its controller's next untap step. For another enter the battlefield tapping ability, whenever another white creature enters the battlefield under our control, Court Street Denizen has us tap target creature an opponent controls. Note that elemental creature tokens created by Hilda are white and blue. Pairing our general with Court Street Denizen could lead to an expanded and enhanced board state very, very quickly. Blind Obedience and Authority of the Councils have creatures our opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. Blind Obedience extends this tap ability to artifacts our opponents control, while the Authority has us gain 1 life whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control. Blind Obedience also has Extort, which allows us to pay a white or black mana whenever we cast a spell. If we do, then each opponent loses 1 life and we gain that much life. Note that Blind Obedience's text is reminder text, and the inclusion of the black mana symbol here does not disqualify this card from being legal in EDH decks without black in its color identity. When Topplegeist enters the battlefield, we tap target creature an opponent controls. Through this Spirit's Delirium mechanic, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in our graveyard, then at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, we tap target creature that player controls. At the beginning of each upkeep, if the creatures enchanted by Curse of Chains and Narcolepsy are untapped, then we tap them. Note that these auras do not keep the enchanted creature continually tapped. The creature untaps during its controller's untap step as normal, then it is tapped when the ability of the aura resolves during their upkeep. Now let's add some combat triggers. At the beginning of combat on our turn, Dream Shackle Geist has us choose up to one of the following. Either we tap target creature, or target creature does not untap during its controller's next untap step. Note that choosing to not allow an opponent's tapped creature to untap will not trigger Hilda's ability. As Citadel Siege enters the battlefield, we choose Khans or Dragons. If we choose Khans, then at the beginning of combat on our turn, we put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature we control. If we choose Dragons, then at the beginning of combat on each opponent's turn, we tap target creature that player controls. Sentinel of the Eternal Watch mimics Citadel Siege's dragon ability, while Timon Youthful Geist is a bit more flexible, as it allows us to tap up to 1 target creature at the beginning of each combat. Whenever Ice Rot Sentry attacks, we may pay 1 and 1 blue mana. If we do, then we tap target creature an opponent controls. Whenever we tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, Ice Rot Sentry gets +2/+1 until end of turn. This creature could become a beat-down option in this build. Whenever Niblis of the Urn attacks, we may tap target creature. Its evasion is helpful for the purposes of triggering this spirit's ability more than once during the game. Whenever Hammers of Meridan attacks, For each opponent, we tap up to one target creature that player controls. This dwarf cleric also has Myriad, which means that whenever it attacks, for each opponent other than defending player, we may create a token that's a copy of this creature that's tapped and attacking that player or a planeswalker they control. We exile these tokens at the end of combat. Note that these creature tokens enter the battlefield attacking. They were never declared as attackers, and therefore their tap up to one target creature abilities will not trigger. For some spell casting triggers, whenever we cast a blue spell, Gadwick the Wizened has us tap target non-land permanents on opponent controls. Also, when he enters the battlefield, we draw X cards. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, Niblis of Frost has us tap target creature on opponent controls, and that creature does not untap during its controller's next untap step. This spirit also has Prowess, which means that whenever we cast a non-creature spell, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Speaking of casting non-creature spells, whenever we do so, Ojutai Exemplars has us choose one of the following three modes. We tap target creature, Ojutai Exemplar gains first strike and lifelink until end of turn, or we exile Ojutai Exemplars and then return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. Guess which mode we will most likely choose. With the core of this build swimming with spells and abilities that tap our opponent's creatures for the purposes of appeasing Hilda, let's include a smattering of cards that provide us with some additional benefits for doing so. Whenever we do so, we put a +1/+1 counter on Gideon's Avenger and a palliation counter on Palliation Accord. We can remove a palliation counter from Palliation Accord to prevent the next 1 damage that will be dealt to us this turn. Whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, if it isn't being declared as an attacker, then Verity Circle allows us the option of drawing a card, and we put a +1/+1 counter onto Rhoda Geist Avenger. The circle also allows us to pay 4 and 1 blue mana to tap target creature without flying, which, if it's an opponent's creature, we will draw a card and trigger Hilda if she is on our side of the battlefield. Note that Rhoda partners with a creature showcased earlier in this video, Timon Youthful Geist. When either creature enters the battlefield, target player may put the other into their hand from their library. For additional thematic card advantage benefits, Theft of Dreams, Borrowing 100,000 Arrows, and the third chapter of Scroll of Isildur draw us a card for each tapped creature target opponent controls, which is the same -2 ability of Tameo the Moon Sage. We can also +1 her to tap target permanent, and it does not untap during its controller's next untap step. If we take 8 loyalty counters off of Tameo, then we create an emblem which gives us no maximum hand size, and whenever a card is put into our graveyard from anywhere, we may return it to our hand. Creating this emblem may make it nearly impossible for our opponents to stop us. Speaking of emblems, note that Scroll of Isildur's first lore counter has us gain control of up to one target artifact for as long as we control this saga, and the ring tempts us. As the ring tempts us, we get an emblem named the Ring if we don't already have one. Then, our emblem gains the next ability, and we choose a creature we control to become or remain our ring bearer. Note that this build does not have any other ring synergies outside of Scroll of Isildur. Chapter 2 of this saga has us tap up to 2 target creatures and put a stun counter on them, which further synergizes with our theme. The adventure side of Illithid Harvester has us tap X target creatures, and they do not untap during their controller's next untap steps. When Illithid Harvester enters the battlefield, we turn any number of tapped target non-token creatures face down. They become 2/2 horror creatures. Note that we can still target these face-down creatures with our tap spells and abilities, much to the chagrin of our opponents. Whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes a target of a spell or an ability we control, Willbreaker has us gain control of that creature for as long as we control Willbreaker. Hopefully, the wills of our opponents to continue playing Magic with us will not be broken as a result. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of an Azorius commander deck with Hilda of the Icy Crown as the general. The cards showcased during this video are suggested options for crafting the thematic core of a Hilda EDH deck, in addition to providing ways of optimizing this theme. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. In building around videos like this one, these deck components are left in the hands of each individual deck brewer. If you found this video appealing, then be sure to check out our other building around videos through the playlists on your screen. Also be sure to check out our other deck building series, and don't forget to let me know your thoughts about the core of this Hilda build in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic.